So let us start talking about debugging. I reordered some of the segments because in view of the fact that we have more homeworks than we've had before in this class, and it is a really fast-paced introduction to Ruby and Rails. We know that, and we're asking quite a bit of you guys to step up to the plate. So let me just give some words about debugging, and none of what I'm going to say about debugging is specific to this course. This is all information that I hope will serve you well in anytime you move to a new language or a new system. Now, compared to debugging command line programs or other kinds of programs you may have written, SAS can be a little bit trickier because, for one thing, you're probably used to being able to sort of printf some stuff and see it in the terminal. There is no terminal in the SAS world, right? It's running on a server somewhere, so the idea that you can have stuff printed out to the terminal doesn't work too well. Also, remember that there's a lot of moving parts in these applications. We start with a URI coming from a browser. There's a routing subsystem. The controller has to get invoked. The model does stuff. So there's sort of all these places where things have to happen. And sometimes an error can occur early in the flow but not become manifest, not show symptoms until later in the flow. And sometimes if it's an error that only arises under certain difficult conditions, it might be hard to reproduce. So that's another thing that's tricky. You've got external users. You can't control what the inputs are. And there's a couple of different things that I'm going to talk about in how you can approach debugging. One thing is something you probably all have done in many other languages, which is printing stuff to the terminal. Some people call that printf debugging. And in development mode, that's fine. You could certainly do that. And I'll show you a couple of different ways. There's logging, right? Even though there's no interactive terminal in the production server, there are certainly log files where you can write stuff. And a colleague of mine has said that log files are actually more important in some cases than the code or than the comments, because the log file, when you write a message to the log file, you're expressing your intent as a programmer of what was supposed to happen in the app. Doesn't mean it actually happened, but you wrote to the log file that you thought this is what's supposed to happen. So that can be very valuable. And when it's time to really bring out the big guns, Ruby has an interactive debugger, and we're going to demonstrate a little bit later on. However, all debugging has the following four-letter acronym in common. We use RASP. It could also be SPAR or PARS or whatever you want. But it's the same four things, right? When you run into a problem, first of all, calm down. Debugging is a fact of life. You're always going to do it. And we're very big on test-driven development and stuff like that. But I would be an idiot to say that that's going to guarantee you'll never experience bugs during the running of your code, right? This is just, we're programmers. It's a fact of life. So first, read the error message. Let me say that again, because it bears repeating, OK? Really read the error message. And sometimes the error message may look like a lot of spew, but in the scheme of things, it's not that many lines of spew, and there's valuable information in there, like usually the file and the line number of where something went wrong. The backtrace, which is a list of all the functions that called you all the way up to the top level where Rails first got invoked. So understanding at least where you should start looking for the symptom is one thing you can find in there. Ask a colleague. You're surrounded by colleagues in the class. You've also got the staff of the course. But when you ask a question, try to ask the most informed question you can. A bad example of a question is, help, my code doesn't work. A good example of a question is, look, I got this far. I expected this variable to have this value, but it seems to have this other value. Or it has nil as a value. And this is the circumstances. So the more information that you give, the more likely somebody could say, oh, yeah, I know what that is. Here's what you might have done wrong. If that doesn't work, you can ask more colleagues on the internet. You can use Stack Overflow, which is one of my favorites, but there are other sites as well. And this is especially true if the error involves a particular version of a library or something like that. Sometimes the bugs don't manifest the same way on different versions, but somebody out there has probably had the same bug you had. So for the more obscure ones, where it's not just a bug in your logic, but there might actually be an issue with the framework, things like Stack Overflow are a great resource. And if you can't find the answer already on Stack Overflow, you can post there. There's also the course forums, Piazza, and so forth. But remember, everybody who reads those is as busy as you are. They're also trying to debug and get their code to work. So to help them help you, give them the most complete information you can, but also concise. So don't confuse complete information with copy and paste the entire transcript of the error message. That takes a long time for them to read. You do the work of reading, and it's your error message. And once you've narrowed it down to a smaller set of circumstances, maybe you can even reproduce the bug in a controlled manner with less code. That's what you post. And those questions tend to get answered within minutes on Stack Overflow. How do you read these error messages? I mean, they are long, but you can parse them. You're all very smart. The backtrace shows you where you came from. So not only where the error occurred, but who called that method and who called that method and so on, all the way up to the top. A very common message, especially in Ruby, is you'll see undefined method something for nil. And 99% of the time, here's what's happening in this message. And I'm using this as a specific example because it is so common. Often it means that you did some sort of a call where you assigned a variable, but you didn't bother to check for an error condition. And a lot of Ruby methods when an error of some kind occurs, instead of raising an exception, they'll return nil instead of returning the object that you expected. So for example, we're going to show later how you talk to the database in a Rails app, and you might do a find on the database expecting to pull out, let's say, a movie from the movies table. And if it turns out that that movie is not there for whatever reason, M will come back nil. And when you try to dereference something on it, well, this is syntactically legal, right? You're trying to call a method on the object. But if M is nil, nil is an object that doesn't know how to do that many things. It is not a very talented object. Hence, the somewhat initially confusing message, undefined method foo for nil, right? When you think about it, it actually does make sense. The value of M is nil, and you tried to call the method title on nil, and that doesn't work. So other things that you can do. Instrumentation, which is a fancy word for printing the values of stuff as you collect the data during the time your program is running. As we'll see, you can put limited amounts of code in your views. I know I've told you shouldn't do it, but sometimes when you're debugging, you got to break some eggs and et cetera. So there's a couple of methods like debug, which prints out, or I should say, generates a string representation of an object that's nicely pretty printed, and you can just stick that right into your view. And your view will look terrible, but given that there's no terminal to print to, this is a good thing to be able to see on the screen. A slightly lighter weight version is inspect. Inspect is a method that is defined on objects. So it's, every Ruby object responds to it, although the default thing that it prints out to describe itself is not necessarily that useful. That's why most interesting classes override inspect and print out something more useful about themselves. They try to print a programmer useful representation of what the object is. You could also write stuff to the log. I am a big fan of logging. Space is cheap. Write log files. There's a logger method that returns the logger object. All controller methods can have access to it. And there's different warning levels like debug and warn and error, just as you've probably seen in other logging systems. Remember, if you try to just use printf or its various equivalents, they have nowhere to go, right? In a production server, they're just going to sort of disappear. And when it comes time to search and using the internet to answer questions, you'd be surprised how far you can get by using the Google, seriously. So suppose your question is, how do I format a date in Ruby? Well, let's pick out the elements of that sentence, shall we? The subject, the verb, and the direct object. Format, date, Ruby. Search for those three things in Google. I guarantee you'll find some results. How do I add Rails routes beyond the standard CRUD ones that get defined for you? Again, look at the keywords in your question, type those keywords into Google, and rely on the wisdom of the world to see if you get an initial step. A lot of error messages have been reported by people other than you, amazingly enough. Read the documentation. We used to have an abbreviation for this, RTFM, but since no one reads anymore, the abbreviation has lost perhaps some of its currency. Nonetheless, there's complete, searchable, nicely formatted online documentation for both Rails and the Ruby libraries, both of which are extensive. Read the source. Rails is source code, right? Rails is actually just a Ruby library that's part of your app. So if you're really curious, you can actually trace back into Rails. And you know, the error occurred somewhere when Rails was trying to do this thing. What is that part of Rails actually doing? You can go read the documentation, find out. And of course, Stack Overflow, my personal favorite. Use Rails console. So we've been using IRB for simple examples, but what you really want is you want a Ruby command line interpreter that actually sort of has the entire environment of your application loaded into it. It knows what database tables you have and so forth. So Rails console more or less does that. In some cases, if you need to inspect the state of the program at a particular point in time, like what happens when I get to this point in my controller method, in those cases, even Rails console is a little bit awkward to use. So a little bit later, I'll show you a demo of a real interactive debugger that you can use in cases like that. So that's kind of bringing out the big guns. You don't need to do that too often.